two separate expeditions into Puerto Rico's El Yunque National Forest encounter beings that simply shouldn't exist. In this episode, I'm going to take you through 3 cases that beg the question, what the hell is happening to hikers? I'm Josh Ninocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of August 5th, 2020, a 27-year-old DJ named Michael Bryson was sitting inside of a converted school bus at a campground in Oregon's Umpqua National Forest. It was roughly 4:30 in the morning, and Michael had been at this outdoor rave party for hours, playing music for the crowd and having a good time with roughly 40 or 50 other people who were all camping out here for someone's birthday celebration. Michael was exhausted. He'd been DJing for most of the night, and the party was finally starting to wind down. And some people, were passed out in their tents, and others were still kind of milling around the campfire. And Michael was just sitting there in this bus that someone had turned into a hangout space. He was thinking about getting some sleep and just turning in for the night. But as he sat there, something just felt off, and he couldn't quite really identify it. He just had a weird feeling like he needed to get some fresh air. So he stood up and he told a couple of the people who were still in the bus with him that he was going to go step outside for just a moment. Now, the Hobo campground where they were partying at is pretty remote. It's just surrounded by thick Pacific Northwest wilderness on all sides, and at 4:30 that morning, it's basically pitch black out there except for the light of the dying campfire. But of course, Michael unfortunately did not grab a flashlight. He didn't even grab his phone. He just walked out of the bus in his white t-shirt and tan shorts and his white Crocs that had these little rainbow decorations on them. The people on the bus would later explain that they figured Michael was just going to use the bathroom or maybe go to his tent to crash. All his camping gear was still there. His tent was set up, his sleeping bag was inside. They had no reason to think anything was wrong, but unfortunately, Michael never came back. About 12 hours later, at around 5 p.m. on August 6th, Michael's parents, Parrish and Tina Bryson, were at their home in Harrisburg, Oregon, when they got a phone call that would change their lives forever. It was from one of Michael's friends who had been at the party, and they were calling to ask if Michael had made it home safely. Parrish and Tina were immediately confused, and he told them he was going to this birthday party camping trip at Hobo Camp, but he wasn't supposed to be home yet, because the party was supposed to last the entire weekend. So Tina asked a friend, what do you mean is he home? He's supposed to be with you guys. And that's when the friend explained that Michael had vanished from the campsite early that morning and nobody had seen him since. They looked around everywhere, they checked his tent, they called his phone, which went straight to voicemail, but there was still no sign of him anywhere. And at this point, Michael's parents were really starting to panic. Their son was 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, with short brown hair and hazel eyes, and he was not the kind of person who just wandered off. They immediately called the Lane County Sheriff's Office to report him missing. Detective Richard Smith was assigned to lead the investigation, and on August 6th, search and rescue teams were deployed to that campground. Now, when the search teams arrived, they noticed something that immediately concerned them. Most of the people who had been at the party were already gone, like they'd packed up and left that same day that Michael vanished. The few people who were still there gave statements to police, but concerningly, their accounts were kind of all over the place. Some people explained that Michael seemed fine when he left the bus, but others said that he seemed disoriented or even confused. Some said he was wearing a brown corduroy baseball cap. Others said he wasn't wearing a hat at all. For whatever reason, nobody could agree on which direction he walked when he left the bus. So, search teams had to basically cover every possible direction Michael could have gone. They used foot patrols to comb through the forest, they brought in horses to cover more ground, and they even flew drones overhead with thermal cameras. They searched along every trail, every creek, every ravine within miles of the campground. But after 19 days of very intensive searching, there wasn't a single trace of Michael Bryson. However, his parents refused to give up, and even after the official search was called off on August 24th, Parrish and Tina kept going back to that campground. They organized their own search parties with volunteers, and they put up missing flyers all over Oregon. In hopes that their son wasn't missing, they continuously checked his bank account, hoping to see some activity, but there was nothing. And for the next several few months, his parents would just live in this horrible limbo, not knowing if their son was truly dead or alive or what happened to him. On December 11th, 2020, so more than 4 months after Michael vanished, a hiker was walking along Bryce Creek Road, which is about a mile west of Hobo Camp Campground, and he spotted something in the underbrush. It was clothing, a white t-shirt and tan shorts. Immediately, this hiker called the police, and when investigators arrived, they confirmed that these were the clothes Michael had been wearing the night he vanished. But here's something really strange. This area where the clothes were found had already been searched multiple times during those original 19 days of the search and rescue op. Search teams had walked right through that exact spot with dogs and everything, and of course, there had been nothing there. So somehow, Michael's clothes had ended up in an area that had already been thoroughly searched, and nobody could explain how or why. Which, by the way, this is not exclusive to this case. There are many other missing 411 cases where something like this or very similar has happened. These clothes were sent to a lab for testing, but they didn't reveal any new clues about what had happened. For starters, there was no blood on them, there was no signs of violence. It was like the clothes were just taken off and abandoned there, and that was it. Additionally, call it peace of mind if you will, but the police found no evidence of foul play or anything bad happening to Michael, but they also couldn't explain how this 27-year-old man just vanished from a campground full of people without anyone seeing anything. Unfortunately, Michael Bryson is still missing. His parents are still searching and still hoping for answers, and as of today, the case remains completely unsolved. If you've seen him or know anything about his whereabouts, please contact the local authorities. On the evening of October 29th, 2023, a YouTuber named Gaz loaded up his camping gear into the back of his van while his dog, Fendi, watched from the passenger seat. Gaz ran a YouTube channel called Grizzly Gaz, where he basically went out to the wilderness in the UK and filmed himself camping in various remote locations. And he's been doing this for a while now. You know, just building up a pretty decent following of people who like watching him go out there and explore and kind of just rough it out in the woods.
Pagans used to dance naked around an open fire and perform rituals.
But this particular camping trip was going to be different from his usual ones, because earlier that week, he had been researching and scouting locations for his next big video when he stumbled across something that was pretty interesting. A forum post about a forest in the UK that supposedly had a lot of legends and rumors attached to it. People claimed that pagan groups would meet up in this forest to perform rituals. And according to these stories, these groups would gather at night, midnight, near this massive fallen tree that was supposedly their meeting spot or altar or something. For Gaz, this was going to be amazing content. I mean, imagine if he could actually catch something like that on camera. And even if nothing happened, just the atmosphere alone would make for a fantastic video. So he's like, you know what? I'm going to go camp right next to this fallen tree and see what happens. So he and his dog, they drive out to the forest, and when they get there, it's already starting to get dark around him. So he grabs his backpack, gets his camera equipment ready, and he's kind of running all around excited because, well, dogs love going on adventures. And then the two of them start trekking into the woods. The hike to find this fallen tree takes roughly about 30 minutes, and the entire time that he's filming, talking to the camera about legends and stuff, the forest just gradually gets denser. And because there aren't really any proper paths, they're kind of just pushing through undergrowth and, climbing over logs and stuff. But eventually...
So, I'll see you up there. And here it is, look. That's the altar stone down there. Up on top of the woods.
He spots what he thinks must be the ritual site. There's this massive tree that had fallen over years ago, and the area around it has been kind of cleared out, like people had been using it regularly. So to him, this is perfect. This is exactly what he was looking for. He sets his tent up right there next to the fallen tree, maybe 20 feet away from it most, and as he's pitching the tent tent and getting everything organized. Fendi's sniffing around the area, and Gaz is still filming, talking about how he's going to stay up and see if anything happens at midnight. Once his camp is all set up, he decides he wants to explore the area a bit before it gets completely dark. So he grabs his flashlight and his camera, and he begins to head off into the woods, leaving Fendi back at the tent. And he's out there for maybe 20 minutes, just kind of getting a feel for the place, and getting different angles of the forest floor. But again, because there aren't really any paths and it's getting darker, he just decides to head back to his tent before he gets lost. He gets back to his tent, and he zips it up, and they just decide to settle in for the night. It's probably around 10 p.m. or so at this point, and they've got a couple of hours before midnight when something might happen. At first, everything's pretty quiet. I mean, really quiet. Gaz is actually commenting to his camera about how there's no sounds at all. Like no birds, there's no insects, there's no forest sounds at night. There's just silence. And he's joking about it, saying that maybe all the animals know to stay away from this place. But then, maybe an hour or so goes by, and both him and his dog can hear a strange knocking sound. It's not like a random forest noise. I mean, it is a deliberate knock, 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 like someone's knocking on a door, but there's no door out there. Now, Fendi immediately starts growling, which is weird because Fendi's usually a really friendly dog, and so Gaz is getting freaked out, and he's whispering to his camera, trying to explain what's happening, and he's telling himself it's probably just a branch falling or something, that there has to be an explanation. But then they hear footsteps, and these aren't like animal footsteps. They're heavy and deliberate, like a person just walking around their tent. And Gaz is trying to stay calm from the camera, but you can tell he's getting nervous. I mean, he came out here hoping maybe something weird would happen and he could catch it on camera. He wasn't expecting someone to actually come right up to his tent. Fendi is just getting more and more upset. You can visibly see her hackles are getting raised, and she's growling, and it's getting louder, and she's very freaked out. We all know how perceptive dogs can be. The footsteps continue to circle the tent, and suddenly something hits the tent, like a rock or a branch or something. It just smacks right into the side of it, and then another and another, and objects are being thrown at the tent from different directions. Gaz has had enough. He grabs his flashlight. He's like, okay, I'm gonna go see what's out there. And Fendi tries to follow him out, but Gaz is doing his best to get his dog to stay put. So he steps outside, his flashlight is swinging around. He's trying to see who's out there, but he can't see anyone. In fact, even though the beam of his flashlight is cutting through the darkness, there's nobody around. And worse is there's no movement from anything or anyone. And at this point, all the throwing has stopped too. It's just dead silent again, and it is so eerie. And he's standing there, he's confused, he's scared, he has no idea what's going on. And after a minute or two of this, he just gets back in the tent, and a lot of things are going through his mind. He's just trying to rationalize it to his camera, and just thinking that, maybe there's just some kids trying to scare me or something, but I don't know. The second he zips the tent back up, there's just this massive boom, this thud against the tent. Something way bigger than a rock just slammed into it. The entire tent shakes, and Gaz's camera, of course, goes flying out of his hands and drops to the ground. Now in the darkness of the tent, all you can hear on the camera audio is just heavy breathing. Not Gaz's breathing, though. Someone else is breathing right outside the tent. And during this, he's fumbling around trying to find his flashlight. When he finally gets it and shines it around, there's something really wrong here. The tent fabric is actually pressing inward in a weird way. He reaches out to touch it, and he realizes he's not in the tent anymore. Somehow in all the chaos, he'd gotten turned around and he's outside the tent in darkness. At this point, he is in full panic mode. He's searching for his tent with just his flashlight, and of course Fendi's barking from somewhere out in the darkness, but he can't tell where. He's disoriented, he's confused, he doesn't know what's happening. He's stumbling around for probably like 5 minutes, and his flashlight finally catches the edge of his tent. So, he runs over to it, and he could see that something has pushed the entire tent down. Like the poles are bent and the whole thing is partially collapsed. Gaz doesn't even try to figure out what's happening. He doesn't care. He just knows that he needs to get out of there, and now. So he grabs his bag, grabs Fendi, grabs the camera that's still recording, and they just take off running. and they're using the camera light to see where they're going because Gaz's flashlight is now gone, dropped somewhere in the chaos, and they're just sprinting through. Of course, branches are hitting them and smacking them, and he's trying to navigate his way through all the thick overgrowth that's happening and try not to trip over roots.
That's where we were. You can pack it in, you can pack it out. Leave no trace.
Fortunately, they're somehow able to make it back. He throws the dog in, he jumps in, starts the engine, and floors it out of there. And he doesn't stop driving until he's miles away. Well, the next morning, after he's had time to calm down and just go over everything in his mind that happened, he decides to go back to get his tent and whatever other equipment he had left. So he drives back there in broad daylight and hikes back to the exact spot where his campsite was. When he gets there, his tent is completely destroyed. Last night, it had been partially collapsed, but now it's been shredded. I mean, it is torn apart, and his gear is just scattered everywhere. But it wasn't until he got home and reviewed all of his camera footage that he realized just how close he came to something really bad happening. When he listened back to the audio from when the tent was being pushed down, when everything was chaos and he was trying to find his tent in the darkness, you could hear something in the background that he hadn't noticed at the time. Screaming. Men screaming. Not like scared, but like war cries or something. And it wasn't just one or two voices. It sounded like there were 20 or 30 men out there. And right before Gaz had grabbed the camera to run, you could actually hear them. They were running. All of them running toward the tent. And it turns out those rumors about pagan groups meeting in the forest for rituals weren't just rumors. There really were groups that would gather at that fallen tree at midnight, and Gaz had set up his tent right in the middle of their site. And when they showed up for their meeting, well, they weren't happy about it. Gaz and Fendi were just lucky they got out when they did. I have saved the strangest story for last. I think you guys are going to enjoy this one. It's weird. On a humid October evening in 1973, a group of 9 people stood at the edge of the El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico, preparing to hike up into the mountains. Their leader was a man named Heriberto Ramos, and he'd organized this expedition because, well, something very strange had been happening in Puerto Rico over the past few weeks. All across the island, people had been reporting strange UFO sightings, and not just like 1 or 2, but tons of them. And not just lights in the sky, but actual craft hovering over neighborhoods and farms, and it was out of control. And what made it even stranger was that around this same time, farmers began finding their livestock dead. Well, not just dead, but mutilated. Like something had surgically removed specific organs from all these animals. So Heriberto and his team wanted answers. And they figured if there really were extraterrestrials visiting Puerto Rico, the most likely place they'd be was El Yunque National Forest. It's massive, it's dense, it's a rainforest that covers the mountains, very remote, and barely any trails. I mean, think, if you wanted to hide from humans, that's where you'd go. Normally, when you're hiking in a forest at night, you'd be worried about predators. But here's the thing about Puerto Rico. There are no large predators. There's no bears, there's no mountain lions, nothing like that. In fact, the most dangerous animal you might encounter is a snake or something. So, as Heriberto and his team began hiking up this narrow mountain trail with their lights, they weren't really concerned about any immediate dangers. They were looking for something else entirely. And they'd been hiking for maybe about an hour when they saw something coming down the trail towards them. Initially, Heriberto thought it was just other hikers, which would have been weird because it was getting pretty late, but not impossible. And as these 3 figures got closer, everyone in the group kind of stopped and stared. These 3 people, 2 men and a woman, they were all wearing the exact same clothing, and identical outfits actually. White shirts, dark pants, and even though that was strange, as they passed by, their faces were different. In fact, they weren't just different from them, but they almost all had the exact same facial features. Same nose, same eyes, same expression. I mean, it was like looking at triplets, except, one was a woman. And so, being friendly, Heriberto just called out to them, just a simple greeting, like good evening or whatever, but these 3 people didn't even acknowledge any of the 9 people in his group. They just kept walking down the trail, their eyes straight ahead, like his group wasn't even there. After they passed, one of the people in the group was like, "That was weird, right? Like, that wasn't just me?" And everyone agreed that it was very strange. But Heriberto, trying to be the voice of reason, just explained that they were probably just locals who didn't want to talk to outsiders. I mean, maybe they were siblings, triplets or something, who lived up in the mountains. And so, just trying to brush past it, they continued hiking, and by around 10 p.m., they found a decent spot to set up camp on the mountainside. It was this small clearing surrounded by thick vegetation, and they figured this was a great spot to wait and watch for UFOs. So they set up tents, they built a small fire, and settled in to keep watch. Now for the first couple of hours, nothing happened. They took turns scanning the sky, but there was nothing unusual, just stars and clouds. At around midnight, as most of the group was starting to get drowsy, they heard something. It was a rustling sound, but it was coming from the vegetation around their campsite. And it wasn't loud, but it was definitely noticeable. There was something moving through the leaves. And then they heard it from another direction, and another, and it was coming from multiple spots around their campsite. Heriberto stood up and shined his light into the trees, but he couldn't see anything. And the beam only penetrated maybe 15 or so feet into the vegetation. And so he called out, asking if someone was there. There was no response, but there was more rustling. Now, I want you to remember that there are no large predators in this area. So he's thinking that maybe it's a small animal, or maybe an iguana or a child. I mean, as this is going on, he just continues to tell everybody, relax, it's probably nothing. But then it continued for maybe another 10 minutes, getting closer and then farther away. Like whatever was out there was circling their campsite. Suddenly, it just stopped. Complete silence. And even the normal sounds, the insects, the tree frogs that are pretty loud in El Yunque, they've gone quiet too. And this weird silence lasted for maybe a minute or so, and everyone in the group was just frozen, listening and waiting, and you could feel the tension in the air. I mean, you could cut it with a knife. Then, the rustling started again, except this time it was more intense. Like not just 1 or 2 things moving around, but like 5 or 6 or more. And they were crashing this time. Crash into the vegetation. There was branches snapping, and it sounded like there were stomping noises. And so, freaked out, everyone in the group grabbed their lights, and they're shining them around the forest. They're trying to get to the bottom of what's happening. They don't understand it. And for the first time, they saw them. There were these figures that were standing between the trees. Around 5 or 6 of them, positioned around the campsite. Even in the flashlight beams, they looked almost human. They were standing upright, they had arms and legs, but they were maybe 5 feet tall at most. But as Heriberto kept his light trained on one of them, he realized something was very, very wrong. That these weren't human beings. Their skin was gray. Not like painted gray or covered in something gray, but actually gray, like ash. And their heads weren't shaped right. They weren't like ours. They were triangular, wider at the top and narrow at the chin. Their ears were long and pointed, sticking up from the sides in their heads. And their hands, well, Heriberto could see long, curved claws that extended from their fingers. One of the women in the group screamed at the sight, and a couple of the men tried to run, but as they turned to flee down the trail, they saw more of these things coming to block the path. And at this point, things were getting pretty real. They were surrounded. These things began moving closer, tightening the circle around the campsite. And they moved in this very unsettling way. They kind of swayed and they crouched. It was very smooth. Their motion was almost like they were gliding. And their eyes, when the flashlight beams hit their faces, their eyes reflected the light like a cat's. Except, obviously they're much larger. And so the group, not knowing what to do, huddled together in fear at the center of their campsite. And they're completely terrified. I mean, what would you do in a situation like this? These things, whatever they were, had completely surrounded them. There was nowhere to go, there was nowhere to run, and they figured this is where their lives would end. And then one of these things steps forward from the rest, and at this point it was maybe 10 feet from the group, and it locked eyes with Heriberto and just stared right at him. And Heriberto said later that when this thing looked at him, he just felt this overwhelming sensation of calm and peace just wash over him. I mean, seconds before, he'd been terrified out of his mind, just filled to the brim with anxiety, and now it's just like he's just totally relaxed, peaceful. And without really thinking about what he was doing, he took a step toward this thing, and then another. And of course, some of his team members were grabbing at him, trying to pull him back, realizing that he was in a trance or being mind controlled or something. Like, this was really strange. But of course, as they're grabbing at him, he kind of just shrugged them off, and he walked right into this thing until he was probably 3 feet away. Heriberto stood there staring, and other members of his team started acting weird too. One guy turned and started walking into the forest like he too was in a trance. Another woman dropped her flashlight and just kind of began swaying back and forth, humming to herself. It was clear that something was happening to his team. Another member, who was still somewhat aware of what was happening, he tried to grab the guy who was walking off into the forest, but as soon as he touched him, he seemed to fall under the same spell. Both of them just wandered off into the darkness, and within minutes, all 9 members of the team were just dispersed, walking through the forest like zombies, like literal zombies. Obviously, they weren't running or panicking anymore, they were just gone. As they walked, they began encountering more strange things. One woman stumbled upon this object on the forest floor. It was egg-shaped and about the size of a football, and it was glowing with this soft white light. And so she picked it up, and it was very warm to the touch, and she just stood there holding it, staring at it. Now, 2 other team members came across more of the gray creatures, except these ones were holding similar glowing egg-shaped objects. The creatures were doing something with them, manipulating them somehow, making the light pulse and change colors. This is all very strange, and the team members were just completely mesmerized and still in the trance. And folks, this went on for hours. All 9 people wandering through in various states of altered consciousness, encountering these beings and their strange glowing egg devices. Nobody was afraid anymore. They were all sharing the same hallucination or dream. And as the first light of dawn began to, show in the sky, something changed. The creatures, all of them, were just gone. And 1 second they were there, the next they weren't. And almost suddenly, all 9 team members snapped out of whatever trance they'd been in, and they found themselves kind of just scattered around the forest in places they didn't recognize, not knowing how they got there or why they were there, and some of them were miles away from the campsite. So, kind of coming back to, and obviously very freaked out and disturbed, they made their way back, and when they all regrouped, they're all trying to figure out what the heck had happened. Had it even been real? Had they all shared some kind of mass hallucination? But there was some sort of proof to what they had experienced. All around their campsite,